That's all I got.
That's all I got. Hi everyone, my name is Marvin Harrison. I'm here today with two very intelligent people that I trust. They're people that I have gone online, see that they say smart things, and then I've asked them to come and join me today to have a conversation about being intellectual. More importantly than that, the world seems to be going anti-intellectual. What on earth is that and why? Well, I have brought today Kyra Ahmed and Ramatha Borta. How are you both?
Feeling very intellectual.
That's a great way to start. What the hell is
Feeling
going
very
on outside
intellectual.
with the Jankros, the Bomberclarts, and the Rascals as to why I feel the world is getting dumber? What's your view?
I wouldn't say dumb.
Is that rude?
Because, yeah, dumb, borderline R word. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
There's a spectrum.
Oh, okay. There's a spectrum.
So I'm not going to call people dumb, but people are moving away from sense.
Moving away from sense.
Yeah.
This is therapy language.
People are moving away from sense.
Right.
How would you word it?
In terms of anti-intellectualism, well, it's the rejection of a certain way of life, isn't it? It's the rejection of the intellectual mind. It's the refusal to engage in intellectualism as a whole.
Mm.
And so, I don't think the dumber frame is necessarily the frame. I think it's more of a refusal to engage in a sort of protective mechanism against the what people sort of frame as elitist and a sort of elitist way of life.
And is it something that you would say is new? Like, I think about when people used to talk about the iPhone, for example, and it was like the iPhone is for the simple mind. The real intelligent people will attempt to get a Samsung because you can build an ecosystem from Samsung in a particular way, and it's not as intuitive, but it's much more impactful. But then iPhone wins every time you put the two devices up together. Is it? When have you observed that happening? Where is it happening?
I think the question of whether it's new, it's certainly not new. I can say that for sure. I mean, if we go all the way back to the 60s and Hofstadter, he defined anti-intellectualism, especially in American culture, and he completely rejected the notion of it and saw it on the rise. And then you had, it was Isaac Asimov in 1980 who coined sort of intellectualism as this frame that, my ignorance is just as good as your knowledge, right?
Okay.
And when we look at it today and, the rise of the phone and social media, anti-intellectualism is not new, it's just more incentivized today. It opens that door towards the rejection of it and the opening of the pseudo-intellectual. So it's always been there. And the sort of public intellectuals have always warned about it. It's just that we are seeing different forms of it now, but it's nothing new. It's been before.
Yeah, it's I think it's just commonly coined in the 1960s by Americans, but at the time it was so popular. Of course, American academia, American culture just traversed the world globally. But I think anti-intellectualism was just never coined. It was always there, a sense of people who traveled more, had more knowledge than people who just stayed in one place, and they were seen as better. In South Africa, for instance, we had two completely separate schooling systems: Bantu education and education for white children. So
what's Bantu education?
Bantu was black education. So the natives, as they called them, used to have a specific lower grade working class education. That was the president for Vurt at the time said it was to avoid them from aspiring from being anything other than a labor force. So it was anti-intellectualism. It was anti-intellectualism on purpose, institutionalized and weaponized by colonization and apartheid in our country. And so those people who went into exile, who studied abroad, came here. A lot of South African exile refugees at the time studied in the UK and in Ireland and in Scotland and in the Western world and in America. And so when they returned after democracy, they were coined clever blacks because they had traveled outside of the barriers and even institutional educational barriers that were set up for black people there. And there is this level of elitism. Like if you're I mean, you see it, just the most practical sense of it is if you've studied and you're the only person in your friend group who went to university, the rest of them maybe just finished high school, you can already see that disparity between when you go back for holiday and you talk about certain things and people are just like, bro, it ain't that deep. It's never that deep. And that transcends, social life, online. People always be like, it's not that deep, or what do they say? You're reaching, right? But it's just the ability, intellectualism itself is the ability to reason and to ask questions. So it's just the ability to be curious rather than saying my worldview or what I understand is correct. And if you disagree with me, then you're different and you're not my people, really.
Who's benefiting from maybe the dumbing down of culture is a phrase that we can use, but anti-intellectualism has risen, but who's benefiting? Does it benefit the individual? Does it benefit me to not want to go, it's not that deep, bro, and just be in the tier 1 of thinking in regards to what's going on around me? Does it benefit me? Does it benefit a company? Does it benefit a government? Why on earth is it so prevalent?
Does it benefit you to ask us questions right now?
Yeah, I'm learning some stuff.
Exactly. So it does benefit everyone and anyone to be curious, to learn what it means to be critical of information, right? Because if you're not critical of any sort of information that you're getting, whether it's a friend telling you a man was shot down the road and you're just like, wow, that's crazy. You don't even go on Twitter. You don't go anywhere else for verification of that event. You're not critical about information. Therefore, I can tell you anything and I can control you and I can suppress you and I can oppress you for as long as I want to, because you don't have enough information to make an informed decision. I think that's just at the most basic level, that's what it is.
Cara, can you tell me about your platform and your content real quick? What kind of content do you make and what made you make it?
Yeah, so I make content primarily surrounding the increase of vocabulary, articulation, because they are incredibly important tools when it comes to intellectualism. Primarily because a lot of people have the coherent thoughts in their mind. It's translating them into the verbal output to reach other people, and that's where the disconnect usually happens. And so I find that it's really important to actually develop those underlying skills so that people can then translate them and be able to speak more confidently about the thoughts that they have, but also, be able to pick up a book and engage with it in literacy, because that's another incredibly important aspect of intellectualism. Literacy isn't just about the ability to read words on paper, it's about the actual comprehension, right? It's about being able to say, what is this text saying? Not just, can I identify the words on the page? It's incredibly important.
Amantha, tell us about your platform real quick.
I just wanted to add to what she's saying before I do. Literacy is one thing, but comprehension levels are insane right now. Like most people can read, but can you comprehend what you're reading? Because if you can't comprehend what you're reading, you can't critically analyze what you're reading. So I think that's the most basic level. And right now, since the 2010s, but it could be earlier, since the popularization of Trump, the ability to think critically has dropped so drastically. I think I saw somewhere in reading up about what, global intellectualism looks like, is that since 2010, about 20% of Republicans' confidence in science has dropped. 20%. That's a lot. To not believe in science and that science is real. All because an orange man told you it's not so. But who are the people that are predisposed to, take that in as real information? It's the people who are educated by a system that engineered them to only think to a certain level. And I mean, the education system is influenced by politics and politics by the education system. And so if you keep a level of education in the rural area underfunded, under-resourced, keep their libraries poor, no funding for those things, you kind of keep that constituency uneducated. If you feed them enough information on an algorithm, if you don't incentivize people reading, if you make parents work more so they don't have time with their children to read at night and do bedtime stories, those are all ways in which you suppress people intellectually, but the main aim is to suppress them physically as well. So it's just a tiered system, really. Anyway, back to
Yes, tell us more about you and your
your
platform.
original content. So I have now coined myself a digital cultural archivist.
Okay. And what does that mean?
It's just basically someone who have had some questions around why people are so ignorant around one another in South Africa, specifically where I come from. There was this big Tyler debate, and that's actually also where I saw
Is that what started it, that conversation?
it started my presence online. One morning I woke up and I saw her on the breakfast show, just anxious, being asked, so school me on this, colour
the
debate.
the Breakfast
Charlemagne.
Club with Charlemagne.
Absolutely.
Yes, yeah.
And this was maybe like 2 years ago now. And she was just sitting there as an artist, at the time, maybe 20-year-old, who doesn't have all of the information. She knows who she is. She knows who her immediate parents are and maybe her grandparents, but she doesn't know the long line of history of her people, right? And I just felt like it was unfair for someone like that to sit and explain such a complex identity. And I said it online. So I was like, I'm so frustrated with the fact that the world thinks that a 20-year-old, by the way, Tyler is smart. She was one of the top students in her school. So it's not like she perhaps maybe didn't know, but she was in media trained, right? And for me, it was such a failure of her team. It was a failure of even the Breakfast Club team.
You know, she signed to Rock Nation now, by the way. Do you know that? Did I tell you that?
Didn't I see there was a false start.
Is it
on
false?
that. I saw someone
I saw it
say
in Times Square. Okay, go on.
Really?
I saw something in Times Square.
That's dope if she is, though. Good for her. But yeah, it was around that time where I decided, look, I'm going to share as much as I know. And then people started asking me. And I grasped that people don't even know the basics between race, ethnicity, nationality, and tribe in South Africa. And then I saw Americans argue about it. And I was like, whoa, wait a minute. So there's an entire country that doesn't know the difference between nationality and race and ethnicity. Oh, we have a lot of schooling to do. So I just started reading up myself. And the more I read, the more I learned and the more I shared. But the thing with intellectualism is the very few of us who are still able to critically engage with literature and then translate that into an ordinary conversation with people are so few and far in between. And I decided to fill that gap. I'm not the only one. There's so many people.
And I think this is to both of you, but what do you have that other people don't have? Because I always think there's an ingredient to your personality that gets you to ask questions. You're not satisfied with what you're presented. You have to go find out more. And some people are like, oh, I heard it from a website that looks formal. I'm taking it. I'm taking it from the Orange Man. Why don't you take it?
I think it's primarily knowing that there is always a question to be asked. For a start, there is always a question to be asked. And going back to, Hofstadter, I mean, he's not the sort of only source for intellectualism, but he's the sort of canonical reference for it. He broke it down into three strands, right? Three distinct strands, sorry. And they were anti-intellectualism in itself, anti-rationalism, and the unreflective instrumentalist, right? The anti-intellectual is the person that refuses to engage with intellectualism, right? They have hostility towards it. The anti-rationalist is the person who believes that, or rejects the belief that the best way to truth is through rational thought, is through these thought systems. And then the unreflective instrumentalist, and that is one that proves to be, the truest today, is the person who only believes that intellectualism is good for the benefit that it provides. So whether that's monetary benefit or, status benefit, right? And this is why people have such a gripe with, spotting the sort of pseudo-intellectual, right? And, the only way that you can really sort of say sort of state yourself as an intellectual. It's really an internal thing. It's a personal thing. It's that I'm always going to ask questions. It's when I see an opinion or a take, that's not going to be the one that I completely embody and I can't let go of it, right? I have to go and ask questions and get my reference points, and I have to also, research the other side of it and really take it on, because at the end of the day, intellectualism now has become something of personal gain.
Can I also insert myself in the sense of the other side, right? And I'm saying the other side not as a reference of them and us, but I'm seeing it specifically with what's happening in South Africa right now, which breaks my heart. And it breaks my heart because I am...
Can you explain what's happening in South Africa first?
So in South Africa, we are now in July. In June, there was an ultimatum given by a specific group in South Africa who has political agendas. At first, they didn't say they had it, but later on it was revealed, as per usual. They riled people up, emotionally riled people up to evict foreign nationals. And it's not foreign nationals, it's black foreign nationals, so it's Africans. Telling them, you need to go back because we are under-resourced and we are overcrowded, and there's a big cohort of you that come here and do no good. Now, there is absolutely grounds for that. But it's obviously these political players that are weaponizing this. And this is not just now, right? This has been coming. About exactly a year ago, there was an operation called Operation Dudula. And they did the same thing. They went into clinics and hospitals and says, our services are crowded, our own people can't use these services. Now, these people are constitutionally protected, right? Any human being in South Africa can access healthcare service. But they took the law in their own hands and said, you can't, right? Now, there's different elements. Media has amplified it, especially media in the West, that made it worse than what it actually is. Where I am in Joburg, I haven't seen a single operation in Joburg where I am, right?
It's happening regionally, right?
It's happening in certain spots in South Africa, right? Some rural areas don't even know what we're talking about because they're living peacefully amongst each other. Anyway, so what I've seen with that entire movement is two things. It has split the black people who are doing the critical analysis of the situation, who are thinking about this in the sense of there's various role players here that's influencing you guys. This is not true. People who are saying, look, statistics are saying they are under 10% of the country. So that cannot be true that they are taking our jobs, right? All of the facts were just pushed to the side because when people are hungry, none of that stuff matters, right? In my immediate vicinity, if I go to my clinic and it's 80% Malawians, you can't tell me otherwise.
So is anti-intellectualism about population control then? Is the pushing of it, the amplification of it, because inherently you're saying the benefit of a large group of people not questioning the information that they got is that they've now pushed to expel a specific type of migrant throughout the country or different parts of the country. But who wins off the back of that happening? Because it's not the actual people doing it. They're not going to get the jobs that probably now just won't exist because there's an economy in the migrants that is now removed.
But there is a level of real change that will come off of the back of this, right? And South Africa's always been a at all cost revolutionary liberation country, right? We and I don't say this lightly, we used to unalive people who we thought were traitors, whether you were guilty or not.
Is this early ANC
This
days?
is early ANC, yes. So what I'm saying is we also have that in the back of our mind that there's always collateral damage at the back end of a revolution.
So the idea of rounding people up, potentially some people losing their life, is not a great cost for progress.
So what I'm saying is, what I'm also saying is that there's no easy yes and no answer for this. And that's the thing with intellectualism, right? It allows you to see the poor person who waits for 8 months to 18 months to just see a doctor. It allows you to also see that it's not realistic to blame that person that's sitting right next to you in the queue, right? But there's a level of these people see you as an intellect as sort of a sense of authority. And if you can't see me as a level of authority, if you don't recognize my pain, I discard your intellect because it doesn't feed me.
Yeah.
It doesn't service me when I need it.
Is there something between like academics and intellect? I used to have this. I have this conversation quite regularly.
I feel very strongly that I'm not an academic.
It's
or
a
even
different, it's
just
a
an
different type
intellect.
of. So for me, I say when I think of intellect, I think of multiple forms like social, cultural, even psychological intelligence being woven together to create a view and perspective. And there are people who are academics who can just read something and recite it on an ongoing basis, right? And they will always be factually correct, but they're unable to maybe. It's almost like the difference between intelligence and wisdom.
It's
Wisdom
exactly
is
that.
is the use of it,
Yes.
and it's not just I know it. It's how do I use it in the situation to be of value.
There you go.
And I do think there is a lot of difference between being able to be someone who's curious enough to go find out answers and being someone who can remember things, say it back to them, and say like I know stuff. I always gear towards intellects over academics, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
For the work that I do, because it matters more. In
How
my
do you
view.
feel?
Yeah, no, I completely agree, and I've always had this sort. I have no aversion towards academics. I'm studying, you know what I mean, and academics are important, points of reference. They're sources, aren't they? But intellectualism is, like we've discussed, it's literally a way of life. It's a way of questioning. Nobody can tell you whether you are, or aren't an intellect. Somebody can decide for themselves if they feel that you are one, but nobody can really tell you that, right? It's always been my gripe, because I think that the point at which we start telling people that, you're an intellect or you're not an intellect, that's where we really bring academic elitism into everyday intellectualism. And intellectualism is just that curiosity, it's that questioning, it's that wanting to learn, and anybody can do it, whereas academia is largely gatekept. Even today it's still very largely gatekept, and it's still very much surrounded around the principles of meritocracy or
Where you're
classism
studying.
and exactly institutional gatekeeping and stuff. And I think that there is a very big difference. An academic can be an intellect and an intellect can be an academic, but you can also have people that are one or the other. And so I don't think that we should necessarily get them confused. And I think that it's very, very easy to, because people look at academics as intellects, because, historically, especially when you think about the fact that academic institutions are the ones that normally, platform the intellects. If you look at, the great public intellectuals of the past and the present, you look at James Baldwin, and we know the very, very famous Cambridge debate, that's when, intellectualism starts aligning itself with academia through the Cambridge Union and the Oxford Union. And so it's very easy to sort of get it confused, but you do not have to be. And I also think that it provides this barrier for people who, simply want to be intellectual or see themselves as intellectual, but they sort of get it conflated with academia so that they feel like they can't enter that space. Whereas you can decide today, I want to be intellectual, I want to ask questions, and I want to be able to, provide knowledge and gain knowledge. It's a constant stream of learning, and we have to be able to separate those two, because they're just not the same.
Is there a way to reflect on sort of the value in, because I think one of the areas that I often disconnect from is when it's intellectualism but there's no action. I'm not saying you have to have action to be an intellectual or not. That's not, it's not a qualifier. But I think when I think about the Black liberation movement or the Black advancement, I always think that if you don't pair it with action, we're almost robbing each other a little bit, because how far back we are, far away we are from a workable way of existing in this world that centers us or values us or sees us. It's like we get these incredible human beings, and just the sport of communicating how intellectual they are becomes the dominating observation, and there is nothing to go with it. Is there a little bit of a charge to throw at people if they're not putting it to some sort of use, into advancement? Is there something to be said on that?
Well, I think that's where we also have to separate intellectualism and activism, because obviously what you're describing is inherently activism. And again, when we look back to the great intellectuals, both of the past and present, Baldwin, Akala, big fan of Akala. And I think that, they're intellectuals, but they're also activists, and many activists are also intellectual. You have to be an intellectual to be an activist. You can't be an activist for anything without inherently also, adopting intellectualism as a way of life. And I think that, whether you can be an intellectual without the actual action, I think that it's not that you can't be. I definitely agree that perhaps you maybe shouldn't be if you are privy to this, if through your questioning, through your decision to investigate, through your decision to adopt knowledge, then you almost have this duty. I definitely believe in that sort of notion of this duty that we owe to ourselves and to others. And so if you're privy to that knowledge, activism can be as simple
Sharing
as
it.
spreading it. Exactly. It doesn't have to be getting out on the front lines,
Very
literally.
true.
But, if you do adopt intellectualism, then yes, you have a duty of some sort to also encourage the people around you in your life, try to change things that are inherently harmful.
I actually wanted to add, with regards to what I was talking about earlier, the sort of anti-immigration or as they say, anti-illegal immigration movement in South Africa, which to me is all the same. What I've seen is a split in who gets to be an activist. And the people who are so-called academics and intellectuals in South Africa who come, like myself, come on social media and sort of dissect and, I want to say, simplify information to the ordinary person so they understand the systems within which they operate and which impact them. You are told you're too privileged for this conversation. This is a matter for the people who actually use these services, who actually are affected by the crimes that are allegedly caused by these people. You are too privileged. Now, I also want to speak to the status of intellectualism and academics, right? There is a sense of ego to it. If you think just how institutionalized knowledge has become, if you're not from Harvard, Oxford, UCT, what would be the Tanzanian equivalent of like the best elite universities? If you are not an alumni of those institutions, then it's almost your intellect and your level of academics is ranked. That's the elitism amongst the intellectuals. Then there's this notion of knowledge separating people, polarizing people. Because I wanted to ask you, what do you make of people weaponizing intellectualism to not hear people's real lived anecdotal experience that isn't necessarily measured by research?
Because there is that thing of just like, and I get into these conversations often when I'm doing like Jeremy Vine or one of those conversations, and for example, can you put the English flag up, right? And I will always talk about how I feel. I'll just say I feel that when I see English flags in the wrong context, my body goes into alert, right? Because I've only seen them used as a weapon against me, never as a way to invite me in, right? You would just get people who would just be like, go home then, right? And you're trying to have a conversation with somebody, but then you're met with that kind of response. And it's very disheartening at points. But I also just feel like there is a thing of where you're using the wrong tool in the wrong room.
Yeah.
So I have this measurement of like, does it work? I call it workability. It's the simplest way that I can go into a room and communicate, because if I communicate for me, I may be completely right, but would I have moved the room to get them into a place where I need them, want them, believe they should be? I haven't been persuasive. And I think we've got to a point now where there is a lot of people who aren't persuasive. And I think one of the things I love about your content, maybe I get to see more behind the scenes than others, is that you question if you should speak.
Yeah.
I think too many people don't question if you should. So there's no emotional intelligence to their intellect. It's just.
But that's where that's where the conversation of ego comes in. I literally just made a video today about not all conversations are for you to have. And also there's space for everyone to have every tiered level of the same conversation, right? You might be like, oh, in our clinic, I'm the only person that is South African, right? And it pisses me off and I want the government to do something. Then the next person goes and says, actually, for the last 5 years, there's been statistics around, patient numbers and demographics at clinics. We're both saying the same thing. You're saying it from anecdotal experience, and I'm saying it from empirical evidence, right? And I think the separateness or the polarization is because Black people just see intellectualism, and not all Black people, right? But Black people don't trust intellectualism because they don't trust institutions. And this is why people, when they say, children Black children specifically, don't value school. It's not school that they don't value. You're missing the point. The structure within which they have to excel is not created for them. There's no space for them. So they reject it altogether. And because they reject it altogether, now it's anti-intellectualism. But what made that person get to a point where they're frustrated with sitting in school and learning something that is so far removed? Like we learned in history, we learned all about Europe and the Western world and nothing about African history. And so you're going to be bored out of your mind. So what is wrong with the education system? That the kids aren't interested in history, aren't interested in the way that you teach maths, aren't interested in the way that you teach very complex subjects. Are you catering to neurospicy children in your school? Like structurally and resource-wise, there's so many things that create anti-intellectualism that it's so disingenuous to say, people are just, they don't have attention spans. There's many layers to it, but most of it is systemic. Even talking about an algorithm, our attention spans are at probably less than seven seconds now.
I've had it at 3 before. You got 3 seconds to grab people.
Right. So our attention spans are like so monetized. Attention is the new capital. And like you said earlier, it's incentivized. So if there's no real incentive for me to actually listen to you, which is what intellectualism requires, it requires mental gymnastics, exercise your brain. That's what it requires. But the systems, which includes our algorithms, has purposefully shrunken our attention. And
Carl,
that's what I mean when I say it's institutional.
Carl, what's the last rabbit hole you went down?
Oh.
I'm gonna answer you, and I'm gonna try and answer myself. So let me check my.
Oh, and then can we talk
recent
about
deep
the hill
searches.
as well? Because I think like it forms part of this
Yes,
conversation.
we can. What's the last rabbit hole you went down? Do you know?
Oh, that is a good question. I go through genuinely 10 rabbit holes a day. It's crazy. No, because it's as soon as a thought will sort of be introduced to me, and then at that second, it's Googling it, and then it's going into random articles and, researching random scholars and stuff like that. So I couldn't tell you what's the last like really distinct one, but I will say I've gone down a lot, and some of them very, very wild.
Yes.
Very wild.
My last one was the history of the Isle of Man, which was owned by Ireland at times, the Vikings at times, English and the Scottish. It has its own rules, its own laws. And every year in July, they read out their laws in the open, and people sit and attend and listen to them. And if the law is not in that readout, it doesn't apply for that year. They don't have any speed limits on most of their roads. That's why they can do the Isle of Man motocross there. It was owned by a family, and the family used to use it as basically a place to hoard illegal counterfeit goods. What's the word? Is it counterfeit? What's the word? Contraband is the word I was looking for. And so what they would do is ship stuff in and then get it into Scotland, England, and Ireland in the middle of the night and sell it and make a significant amount of profit without paying taxes. So the UK government bought it off that family for £70,000 in this is years ago, so that they can have more control, but it's not officially a part of the United Kingdom. I was like,
I love that rabbit hole.
Yes. Like it has zero capital gains tax, it's very low corporation tax, and I was like, should I be setting my business up there?
Yeah.
And my advisor said, hell no.
I'm not going to lie to you. Most of the content that I produce is as a result of sharing my rabbit holes. And my rabbit holes are still within the thing that I'm doing, right? But you're right. I enjoy it so much, man. Like just allowing your brain to roam freely and think about an idea uninterrupted. Oh, I enjoy it more than people's company, because I don't feel a lot of people can do that back and forth with you and expand on an idea and add. It's like creating a meal. It's two cooks creating a meal, and at the end you either both learn something or you're like, oh, I didn't know you think that way too. It's such an intimate way of connecting with someone. I wish more people would do that stuff, you know. But also what I wanted to say earlier on about people who reject intellectualism is because of the polarization of ordinary person who perhaps maybe is not highly educated and the educated. That polarization creates shame for the person who's trying to meet you in the middle. But the intellectual stands their ground, and they stand there with their empirical evidence and say, no, but, and reference so many citations about their point. The sort of lesser schooled person, that's what I'm going to call them now, lesser schooled person is going to stand there and say, yeah, but, you know, I have black friends, so I can't be racist, right? And that's where we forget to meet one another. There's no coming to the middle and saying, well, I get what you're saying, though.
I always reflect on something like question time, because I think question time is a great reminder of how we think different and communicate differently.
What do you mean with question time?
Question time is a BBC long-standing political show. It's a panel which will have representation from multiple political figures, MPs from different parties, with a host in the middle and a whole audience of people from a spectrum of political landscape, and they will bring up topics, and then someone on the panel will sit there and be like, oh, the reason why, you'll have like a populist argument which is like, we want our country back. Then you'll have somebody who will sit there and be like, well, actually net migration is a positive
in
on
South
our
Africa.
economy.
It's called the Great Debate.
Okay, yes. But then you'll find a taxi driver in the audience who will hear all the sophisticated reasons as to why migration is fantastic, and he will be just like,
debunk it
mate,
with just
10
one
years
thing.
ago,
Yeah.
I could get in my taxi and talk to the person next to me. I can't now because no one wants to talk to each other because of migration. And then there's no answer for that in the realm of...
I have another question, though. And this is, I'm just going to throw the question out there because I have my own opinions. But what do you guys make of people who use academics and intellect to shield themselves from their own humanity?
I think there's a word from that, though, isn't it?
Can you sort of expand on that more?
So, again, I'll take the example that I did with South Africa earlier. There's so many real agendas that need to be advanced in that movement, right? Real people, real lived experience, real institutional and structural neglect and human neglect. But the vehicle for it makes it very hard for people who are intellectuals and who reason on that level to meet the people with humanity. So both reject each other and no one is meeting each other in the middle. My question to you is, do intellectuals, do they sort of pad their own humanity with intellectual arguments in order to win or be right or seem smart in the room?
What's your thoughts?
I think that for a start, I really, truly, and this is my personal view, you know, and everyone will have their own sort of definitions around intellectualism, but I think that you can't really be an intellectual without having empathy. You can't really not adopt empathy within your intellectualism. And I think that there is no way in which you can't put yourself or try to understand others' experiences because they come from some sort of place, right? And, you know, phenomenological experiences are real and they are valid. You know, everything doesn't have to come from this sort of, you know, prove it to be true. It doesn't have to be empirical. It doesn't have to be epistemic. You know, it can be lived experience because that's often how a lot of movements start. It starts from multiple accounts of lived experiences that, you know, then become eventually, you know, studies and empirical evidence. And, you know, it grows and grows. But I think that to call yourself, you know, a sort of intellectual, and I reject that idea that, you know, humanity in itself cannot be part of the world of intellectualism. And I think that is it's a bit of a sort of personal cop-out, I think, in order to refuse to actually engage. But it's also, like you were saying earlier with the whole ego thing, I think that it's this inherent belief of, being better than somebody else because you feel like you maybe reason on a more objective or rational basis compared to somebody that may be telling their experiences from a more emotional point of view, right? But their experiences can also be valid. And, no, it doesn't mean that every experience has to be taken sort of literally, because again, it's that whole thing of my ignorance is just as good as your knowledge, right? But you have to sort of meet in the middle. For example, even with people whose views I vehemently disagree with, as frustrating that as it is, I have to sit there and really ask myself, where does this come from? How did you get to that place of, adopting that belief, or, being able to think and see the world in this particular way? And I also think that, there's this sort of form of, okay, if you maybe don't have the same intellectual capacity as person A, and, that means that you inherently have less value in terms of what you can contribute and what you can say. And I think that those ideas are quite dangerous, again, because it kind of goes back to, it underpins the systems of meritocracy as well. You have to be, good enough to be able to actually have a valid experience. And I don't think that necessarily because you can sort of, speak in a more logical, reasoned way, or bring in your sources, or be more objective or rational, that means that all of a sudden you have to sort of reject, the person who doesn't. And I think it's also the argument, what we see a lot as well, when you see the whole sort of it's got the same sort of underlying mechanisms as the whole sort of atheism versus religion argument, where an atheist may see themselves as somebody who only thinks rationally, as opposed to who they view to be anti-rationalists, somebody who is religious, etc. And I think that there can be no point in which we refuse to engage with other people's experiences, because you cannot be intellectual if you completely close the door on experiences that are not necessarily, your own, or that you do not believe are rooted in logic or ration or quote unquote objectivity. Because what exactly is objectivity?
Absolutely.
There's
Can I
also
just quickly say, because we're going to wrap, I want you both to do a summary for me on the main points that you've made today and anything that you've missed.
yeah.
And I want to give you some time to think about it. I'm going to say, when I started this conversation, I was thinking about this from a point of view of like it being almost like a product that's presented to us. If you dumb it down, if you make it simple, if you make it easy, if you make it really accessible to the masses, everybody feels like they have a right and ownership to every conversation. That means the conversation never really grows and develops. And it ends up all of us being slightly dumbed down, because I'm trying to argue for the rights of lives. Yours just saying, I don't feel like it. And they're platformed in the exact same way and accepted as the exact same way. I also look at things like Drake versus Kendrick, which is, yeah, but I can't listen to it in my car, or the girls don't like it. So when I have girls around my house, they don't like listening to Kendrick, so I'm not listening to him. And that's the only lens in which you process art forms, right? And I was always thinking about it almost like a product that's presented to us or sold to us for ease. I never really considered it as a inside out thing. I never considered it as a thing that I would have to say to myself, I want to stay curious as an intellect. And to do so, I have to be empathetic, I have to be open, and I have to be genuinely interested in the topics and take it and follow the journey of wherever it takes me.
Yeah.
I
the
think
rabbit
in that
hole.
reframe, I'm almost like warming up to the idea of how powerful it could be to invite people who have shut down into remaining open, rather than think of it as a product that's been sold to us that we didn't want. Like an iPhone.
Talking of the product that was sold to us, I wanted to say before you want us to close, the other thing that we need to consider is decolonizing intellectual or academic information. Africa, and I think South Africa specifically, that I can speak to, we are now moving to a decolonized education system. Because in Africa, we were taught more about the Western world than we were about our own African empires and ancient histories. All of those things weren't a part of my curriculum when I was in school. And all of those intellectual sort of academic works that we studied was filled with colonial agendas. And so there's been, I want to say at least for the last 20 to 25 years, there's been an active move in our academic spaces to decolonize even the things that we were taught. So even the intellectuals that argue, and that's what I wanted to ask about your education system here, that is so colonial, is there even a way in which you now, as someone who's educated, as someone who sort of reads, you always have to criticize even your current intellect because it is so heavily informed by the patriarchy, by colonization, and by imperialism. It is infested with it. So how do you, even as an intellectual, use the information that you have, not as a weapon, but to re-educate yourself? That is important. So I think for me, the standout of today's conversation is that anti-intellectualism and intellectualism is polarizing us. Our algorithms are creating echo chambers, which doesn't allow us to reach for each other's opinions or differences in opinions. And then as a result, we are now sitting with a heavily malleable, easily manipulated population that if you have a, God forbid, but if you have now a right-wing prime minister, that you already have fertile ground for any PR agendas to tap into things that you already see on your algorithm. So it's very dangerous. It's very dangerous for us to say it's not that deep. Everything really is that deep.
I always feel slightly limited by how profoundly you speak using your second language, and I'm going to take a moment of shame for myself. Would you like to? I'll just sit there thinking. I just remember this is not even your first language. Yeah, like you're thinking in Afrikaans and then like jump to English. What's your final thoughts?
My final thought, something that I've really had to come to terms with and learn, and it really arches on your point as well about decolonizing, education, but also decolonizing our way of viewing education as well, because when we view intellectualism, we sort of view it in this very narrow form, and it's a very elitist colonial form, right? But intellectualism today, especially when we talk about cultural intellectualism or intellectualism within the Black communities in particular, can look very different to what your standard forms of intellectualism may look like. Rap music today, so many rap artists can be considered intellectuals because when you listen to their music, right, they're able to coherently present these actually quite complex ideas and break down these complex systems into plain English, very simple plain English for people to be able to take in, to understand, for people to feel like they can finally understand their own lived experiences and their own thoughts. And they are themselves also intellectuals. They may not be the traditional sense of intellectuals, but they are still intellectuals. And we have our own versions of intellectuals within our own communities and, within our own systems. And just because it may not look like the very traditional colonial sense of intellectualism, it doesn't necessarily mean that we cannot then call ourselves as a community, intellectuals. It just doesn't look the way that it's always, and I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing to create our own avenues of it. I think it's a great thing, actually. So I think that we sort of have to stop viewing it in a very narrow sense and start to understand where we can find it, instead of trying to push our own community into this box of this is how you have to be an intellectual, otherwise you're rejecting intellectualism, right?
Yeah.
And start thinking, well, actually, where does the intellectualism already live and how can we then expand on that?
Our gogos, our grandmas, they have inherited DNA that's intellectual on its own. And we didn't have science to tell us that you take this bush, you take that bush, you put it in hot water, and that helps you with your reproductive health. Or you take this one, and you take that one, or you eat the bark of this tree. We didn't know that. But that kind of intellectualism is what we're trying to decolonize and make it as credible as our, institutionalized intellect.
Thank you, Cara, Romantha. I appreciate you. Thank you for coming down and having this conversation.
Thank you.